We've seen our discourse degraded by casual cruelty. At times, it can seem like the forces pulling us apart are stronger than the forces binding us together. Argument turns too easily into animosity. Disagreement escalates into dehumanization. We've seen nationalism distorted into nativism. We've forgotten the dynamism that immigration has always brought to America. We see a fading confidence in the value of free markets and international trade, forgetting that conflict, instability, and poverty follow in the wake of protectionism. We've seen the return of isolationist sentiments, forgetting that American security is directly threatened by the chaos and despair of distant places. The American dream of upward mobility seems out of reach for some who feel left behind in a changing economy. Discontent deepened and sharpened partisan conflicts. Bigotry seems emboldened. Our politics seems more vulnerable to conspiracy theories and outright fabrication. People of every race, religion, ethnicity can be fully and equally American. It means that bigotry or white supremacy in any form is blasphemy against the American creed.
What we can't have is the same old politics of division that we have seen so many times before, that dates back centuries. Some of the politics we see now, we thought we put that to bed. I mean, that's folks looking 50 years back. It's the 21st century, not the 19th century. Come on. Folks don't feel good right now about what they see. They don't feel as if our public life reflects our best. Instead of our politics reflecting our values, we've got politics infecting our communities. You notice I haven't been commenting a lot on politics lately, but here's one thing I know. If you have to win a campaign by dividing people, you're not going to be able to govern them. You won't be able to unite them later if that's how you start.
So, Michael Beschloss, you had a very unusual scene yesterday of many former presidents, especially if their last names are Bush, right, don't even talk about their successors in a negative way. George W. Bush, for the most part, bit his tongue for 8 years, even when the Obama team admitted that they ran hard, not against John McCain, but George W. Bush. But yesterday, you had President Bush, a member of the same party of the sitting president, and Barack Obama, obviously president of the opposite party, both attacking the sitting president on the same day in his brand of politics. George W. Bush attacking casual cruelty, bigotry, lies, nativism, protectionism, isolationism, says white supremacy is blasphemy against the American creed. This speech was aimed directly at the heart of Trumpism.
Totally. And, you know, Joe, it was unusual. You're absolutely right. The Bushes don't like to do this. George Bush 41 wrote Bill Clinton this letter on inaugural day 1993 saying, you know, I will leave you alone. Don't have to worry about my criticizing you. But, you know, the thing is, if you look at all this, who would have ever thought that in the year 2017, any former president would feel the need to criticize the sitting president of the United States? And I agree with you, this was absolutely aimed at Donald Trump for encouraging bigotry and white supremacy. You know, it's that that's not normal. It's that should cause this big departure from tradition. And you're absolutely right. What we saw yesterday is something that we have not seen in modern times. You know, modern presidents really restrain themselves. Think of Jimmy Carter in the early 1980s when Ronald Reagan was following policies that were in many ways almost diametrically the opposite. Carter was very polite, was very quiet. That's the normal. But for George W. Bush especially to depart from that tradition, you can imagine how strongly he feels.
And Heidi Przybyla, this comes on the back a couple of days ago of that extraordinary speech made by Senator John McCain. Joe Biden was there with him, the former vice president of the United States. You add in yesterday 2 former presidents. It does seem like the sort of old guard of American politics has watched what it's watched over the last 9 or 10 months and said, we've got to come out, sad as it is, and reaffirm what America is, reaffirm what our values are, reaffirm what the best of the country is. And they've all done that seemingly almost in concert over the last week or so.
Well, let's look at it this way. When you tick through all of those names and you talk about 2 former presidents in 1 week, one of the most senior and respected senators in John McCain, in his own way, Trump is uniting people. And I think collectively, the way to look at this is that these as senior statesmen are worried about the very fundamentals of democracy, that George Bush, who sat through so much during the campaign with his brother being ridiculed and his own policies being criticized, would choose this moment to speak out. And as someone who covered Bush, I can kind of understand perhaps some of the emotions behind this, because if you all remember, prior to 9/11, what George Bush wanted to do with the Republican Party was to take the Republican Party to into the next century by starting out by appealing to Mexico. That was one of the first trips he made, was to go down there and make clear that the Republican Party was going to be a big tent party and welcome all. He saw a connection there, perhaps even on a religious level, that these are people of faith. George Bush was the person who, after 9/11, then went to that mosque in Washington and made clear that whatever kind of hateful tendencies may have been simmering underneath and may have been directed at American Muslims, that was kept under wraps, that he should now view Donald Trump potentially as someone who came and kicked that over and unleashed some of that hateful rhetoric that we're now seeing.
Hey, Joe, can I ask you a question? It's a sobering theory that obviously we're seeing all these great leaders come forward and uniting. And what scares me is it gives Trump the opportunity to blanket and say, oh yeah, all of the establishment, all of the guys that got you in the shape you're in right now if you don't have a job, of course they're coming out. I am the solution. So there is this kind of double-edged sword to everybody coming out and people we do respect, but Trump will be able to somehow whitewash them with problems of the past. Of course they're speaking out this way.
Well, I mean, he could do that. I think the most important thing now is for people that once supported Donald Trump, who also voted for George W. Bush twice, or maybe people that voted for Donald Trump but voted for Barack Obama twice, and there's certainly a lot of them in the upper Midwest, will look at these men that they voted for twice, men that they respected, and actually say, hey, wait a second, maybe they're onto something. And Noah Rothman, every time my retweets these days are usually of writers like you and John Podhoretz and others, Noah, that are well-known conservatives, people that have a conservative following who continue to be skeptical of what Donald Trump is doing to conservatism, the Republican Party, and the nation as a whole. Don't you suspect that George W. Bush coming out will at least send a signal to some traditional Republicans that maybe it's not just those talking heads on TV, maybe this guy is disconnecting us from what made the conservative movement the conservative movement?
I wish it would. I'm a little skeptical. George W. Bush received a lot of criticism from conservatives on a variety of issues, legitimately. Compassionate conservatism rang in the ears of many conservatives as reckless spending. And that was a legitimate critique. And you're already seeing from Trump supporters that this speech, they are conflating it with immigration reform. They're saying the 06 immigration bill with a pathway to citizenship is what George Bush's legacy was supposed to be, and he didn't like it, and calling anybody who wants to enforce borders bigots is the wrong way to go about it. That's a conflation of issues, and people need to say, you remember Judge Curiel, Remember the Muslim database. Remember how we had a selective memory about David Duke. And you wouldn't want me to, denounce groups that I don't know anything about, being the KKK, being that group. I mean, it's not as though these tiki torch wearing or Nazi sympathizers came from nowhere. This happened over the course of a very short period of time, and it was inspired and legitimized from somewhere. And we need to be very clear about what that is in serious, narrow and circumspect terms. This isn't about immigration. This isn't about the border. This is about rhetoric. It's about sentiment. It's about what the country means.
So, Yamiche Alcindor, there's also the effort by General Kelly yesterday to address the other issue that has just been so stunningly sad, given the national conversation, and that is the Gold Star families and how they're treated at their time of need. Do you think the former president's words helped or hurt John Kelly in his ability to do his job with President Trump to try and educate him?
I think that John Kelly in some ways echoed what we saw George Bush and Barack Obama say, and it's this idea that there were these sacred values that Americans, I think, thought were things that we shouldn't be, that were sacred. And so when you think about John Kelly's speech talking about women, talking about the Army, the issue here, of course, is that I interviewed the mother. I actually got in touch with the mother of Sergeant Johnson. I shouldn't say I interviewed her. We were exchanging Facebook messages, and what she told me was that she was backing the Congresswoman's version of this event. And I think what's important there is that while General Kelly backed up his boss and said that I support the way that President Trump did this, he said he was trying and essentially failing to be empathetic to this family. He didn't mention the fact that the Gold Star family themselves also felt disrespected, and that the soldier's mother, apart from the Congresswoman, had real issues with the way that the president spoke to Sergeant Johnson's widow. He didn't say any of that. And I think that was what became an inherently political moment. It's this idea that while John Kelly, who's a Gold Star family himself, is talking about the president and saying that, that this week that we've in some ways kind of taken away the sacredness of Gold Star families, he didn't actually say that this Gold Star family, that this commander-in-chief failed when he talked to this Gold Star family. And one of the things that was important was that President Trump said that the congressman completely fabricated this, that he didn't say anything like that. And General Kelly, of course, said, well, he actually did basically say exactly what the Congresswoman said. He just meant it in a different way. And you can see how the way that General Kelly said it would be important. But I think that the also important thing to note here is when we talk about George Bush and we talk about Barack Obama, I've talked to people who are both working in like Homeland Security, and those people tell me that when you look at George Bush and his legacy, he was a president who essentially saw the beginning of a system where thousands of people were racially profiled. This was a president who had Hurricane Katrina and people blatantly saying that the president didn't care about African Americans in New Orleans and failed them in the height of a crisis. So when we talk about George Bush, it's important to note that while in some ways President Trump has changed the expectations for presidents, that you should just be able to call out white supremacy, much like George Bush did. It was obviously not an issue for him to do that, where President Trump struggled in the back of Charlottesville, at the end of Charlottesville. President Bush has his own really hard history when it comes to race, and there are people who essentially said that you oversaw a racist regime in some ways. So I think when we think about him, it's interesting to me to see him in this light, because he is having a sort of second life. But there are a lot of people who very much remember the fact that thousands of people died in Afghanistan, and thousands of Gold Star families were thinking about that.
Joe.
Well, Michael Beschloss, people who said that George W. Bush ran a racist regime are to say engaging in hyperbole would be kind.
Yes.
This is a man
I agree.
who after 9/11 went to a Muslim center in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 and embraced Muslims and said
Absolutely.
that attacking Muslims would be un-American when it was probably very unpopular for him to do. I speak as someone who, as anybody who watched me on TV from 2004 to 2008, remember, eviscerated George W. Bush every night. So I have been I have not been a political fan of his, but the one thing I always respected about George W. Bush is even if I didn't agree with a lot of his policies, he did understand what Donald Trump does not, and that we are better as a nation when we are united, and any bigotry, even as he said, the soft bigotry of low expectations is unacceptable.
I totally agree with what you've just said, Joe, and I think that's what moved him to come and speak out yesterday, which, as we've said, is not easy for him. And I think what he said underlines the fact that we've never seen this before in history. You know, Joe, there are 5 former presidents living right now. How many of them does Donald Trump have any relationship with? 0. We haven't seen that before in American history. And I think Donnie is right that he will use that as a foil. But I think it does say something about this presidency. And what George W. Bush was basically essentially saying was Donald Trump may be trying to suggest that he's part of some great modern historical current in history that's legitimate. And what he was basically saying yesterday was that's absolutely wrong. Donald Trump and the people who encourage him and the people who talk about white supremacy and bigotry, they are fringe and they have to be called that. That's something we haven't seen in recent times.
And Nick Confessori, I'm curious. I want to get your opinion on what Donnie Deutsch asked earlier about whether yesterday was a positive or something that Trump would use. I mean, for me at least, and maybe I'm just too optimistic, I think yesterday showed that Donald Trump and Steve Bannon are clinging to a way of life that was dying 50 years ago. That Donald Trump will always be seen as the death cry of this extremism, this nationalism, this nativism. What did you see when you saw George Bush and Barack Obama and even John Kelly talking about we are a nation that once valued sacrifice, that once valued women and treated them with respect, that once valued the fallen and their families? How did you take in everything that happened yesterday?
You know, speaking of Bush and Obama, Joe, I actually had a different reaction. I saw 2 men whose policies were in some sense repudiated by the election of President Trump. And I saw them kind of shouting into the wind. You know, President Bush left office deeply unpopular. He plunged this country into war without end in the Middle East that is still reshaping the world and our country, and a bubble economy that led to a huge crash. And I think that those 2 things actually gave rise to Donald Trump, set the conditions for him to rise. I think it's Trump's party now. You know, Bush was very forceful in keeping a lid on this kind of nationalism when he was president. In the wake of 9/11, he spoke at a mosque. But I think those forces were always there. I think that Trump has unleashed them, and we can't go back, and I'm not sure that we will go back to a different time anymore.